All right, folks, I'm going to try something a little bit new here today. It's a way for me to try to get some content up a little bit faster because, as I've told you guys, this isn't my main gig by any means, and I do like posting this stuff, and so I'm going to try this kind of new way to do some reaction type content and see if I can get things up a little bit faster. And so today I'm going to be looking at a video that came across my feed a couple days ago from History Valley with Jacob Berman, a fairly popular skeptical channel that brings a lot of people in to discuss various issues on religious studies and biblical topics. And this time he had the infamous Dr. Bart Ehrman on his show. So let's just watch the first bit of this, and I'll react to some things here.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream for History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Bart Ehrman, and today we'll be discussing his book, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why.
Okay, so just want to start before we jump into this. This is a very popular book. I've read this book a couple of times. Actually, when I first read it, I was, as a Christian, pretty down because it was a book that I assumed, hey, this is one of the leading scholars. He's talking about stuff that he knows a lot better than I do or than any other one else would do. It's sold millions of copies, must be true. And I'd say this book, probably more than anything, kicked off my journey to kind of figure out what was really true. Why was the stuff that I thought I believed in totally made up, according to Professor Ehrman. So we'll continue here a little bit.
I want to start off with this. How do scholars discern from the various alleged quotations of Jesus in the New Testament from what Jesus actually said contained within the New Testament? Like, scholars debate this all the time. What did Jesus actually say? Because I know at the Jesus seminar, they concluded he didn't say most of the things that were attributed to him.
Okay, so again, you see these statements at the beginning and look at the framing. Again, I'm not going to, nitpick on the framing too much. Obviously, this is framed from the perspective of a skeptic, and so they're justified in being sort of critical and skeptical about anything in the Bible. But if you look at what's talked about here, there is a reference to the Jesus seminar that says, almost nothing Jesus said can be attributed to him. Now, just take a second and ask yourself, where does that analysis come from? Okay, where does it come from? Because is it coming from some other first-hand accounts from the time that said, no, Jesus never said any of these things? No, it's not. Is it coming from some kind of archaeological finding that says, here's what we know about what Jesus said and didn't say because we uncovered some ancient artifact that says things were totally different than what was reported in the Gospels? No, it doesn't come from that either. What it comes from is historians 2,000 years later, really with very little sort of proper historical analysis, just making judgments willy-nilly about what they think happened and why. There's really, when you probe and say, where are you getting this specific information that this could not have been attributed to Jesus, you won't find anything. So let's keep going.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So, it's a very important question. It's long been one of the central questions within the study of the New Testament. The difficulty is that we have different reports of his sayings in different Gospels. Sometimes the two Gospels report the same saying in different ways, and in some Gospels.
All right, so let's just, again, pause on this point here. So some Gospels report the saying in two different ways. So you can look at that and say, okay, well, we have two different versions. Let's for now just assume that these are two separate versions that weren't influenced by one another. We know, or we have very good reason to believe, that there was literary dependence between at least the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But just even setting that aside for a moment, let's just say we have two different versions of a saying that don't exactly line up. Now, it should be obvious that that is not by itself a reason to doubt the veracity of anything, especially of the time that these sayings are being recorded. And that's because even amongst us in the modern age, there are many situations where we might come across something that we witnessed and report what we heard and not get the quote exactly right. This shouldn't be an issue that would discredit any historical text at all. But for some reason, it's uniquely used to discredit the texts from the Bible and from the Gospel specifically. Let's go.
Like in the Gospel of John, he talks about things completely different from what he talks about in the others. So one has to decide what did he probably say. Plus, we have Gospels from outside the New Testament, and you have to figure out, well, did he say any of those things? And so what scholars do is they basically apply the same criteria they would apply to anybody trying to figure out what they really said.
So he says what scholars do is they apply the same criteria they would apply to anybody to try to figure out what they really said. For a number of reasons, that is not accurate with respect to biblical studies. Here, with respect to at least the canonical Gospels, okay, for now we'll set aside the apocryphal Gospels and the Gospels that by almost all credible accounts came after the canonical Gospels. There's really very little credible evidence to the contrary of that. So, we can get into it another time, but pretty much all of the credible analysis shows that the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and even John, came before these apocryphal Gospels. But even looking at those, the historical standard would not be to try to parse one or two word differences, even missing phrase differences between four different texts. That would not be the appropriate historical way in any other historical context to do the analysis. In fact, what would be done typically historically is you would take the four different texts and would try to create a harmonized account of saying, okay, given that these two or three things are repeated more or less the same in these other texts, in say two or three of the Gospels, we're going to more likely credit that as being accurate and true. And again, in every other historical context and every other historical analysis, that's how it's done. It's just not done with respect to biblical studies. So your antenna should be up already that there's something else going on here. Let's continue.
Today it's a bit easier because you have recordings, and so it's a little bit hard for a presidential candidate to say, "I didn't say that." They have to say, "Yeah, I said it, but I didn't really mean it," or something like that. But with Jesus, you don't have that. And so, how do you go about deciding? And the criteria you use typically for trying to understand anybody's sayings from the past would be things like, do you have sources that are independent of one another who are reporting him saying that thing or similar things to that? Do you have a lot of sources that say that's what he said?
Let's pause here. All right. So, do you have sources independent of one another that say this is what he said? Yes, totally agree. This is how historical analysis is done in all other contexts. And in this particular circumstance, almost by the way the question is stated, it leads one to presume that we don't have that here. We do have that here. We do. We have four different sources that say Jesus said certain things. Now, we've already discussed, and I've done a number of videos on this, elsewhere, that there is a literary dependence between at least the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I've argued, I think, strongly and persuasively that Matthew was the first of those Gospels. But even setting that aside, there is a literary dependence between those Gospels. That said, that does not mean that the other two accounts, and then also John, are not separate sources. It's almost a hand wave that gets tossed out there to make us believe, well, since there's a literary dependence, these sources aren't independent. That's just not how the logic flows in any other context, and it's not how it should flow even in an isolated context. So let's keep going.
That didn't get it from each other. And you look at it and you say, well, if you do have things of Jesus that he didn't say, that must mean that somebody put them on his lips, like a later Christian wanted him to say something that he didn't say. And so if you've got sayings of Jesus that are perfectly lined up with what Christians wanted him to say, then it's a little bit hard to know whether he said it or not. You see?
All right. So again, I can't emphasize enough. When I first encountered Professor Ehrman's scholarship, I was really distraught. It was a point in time in my life when I was already skeptical to begin with. If I've not said so already, I went through a long phase of complete skepticism, and I would say agnosticism for a while. And when I first encountered the Professor Bart Ehrman scholarship, and again, I don't want to. This is not a knock on the scholars. I really try not to do that. I do find a lot of the scholarship to be poor, and I think that's a fair criticism. But this is not a knock on the person or the individual themselves. But when I first encountered the scholarship, I was discouraged because I said, this is the person who's dedicated their whole life to this. I don't follow this. This isn't my field. I've been in academics my whole adult life, and I sort of trusted that this is going to be held up to scrutiny, and if he's saying this, and this is the standard. And then you look at statements like this, and you just have to scratch your head. You say, well, if this may be what Christians at the time wanted Jesus to say. Later Christians wanted Jesus to say. And again, that could be true. That's certainly a valid skeptical position to take, but it can't just be taken free form without linking it to actual evidence. If it's just an opinion, if it's just a hypothesis, and again, it's an hypothesis with an extra set of assumptions that we may not need, we can't just take it as credible because a very smart and well-read and well-credentialed scholar said so. So again, let's keep going.
You know what I mean? But if you get if Jesus says something that seems to be contrary to what Christians would have wanted them to say, well, they didn't make that one up. So then you're pretty sure that, okay, those are ones that he probably said.
So again, I want to comment on this. I think there's some accuracy here, and then there's a bit of text that can be misleading, context that can be misleading. Certainly, historically, if there are statements that are made that are sort of against interest, that are against an agenda, a statement that may be critical of a particular point of view, for example, Jesus, failing to do something, or Jesus committing a sin, or anything like that, and you found those in the text, it is well-regarded historical principles to say that's more likely to be true than not, because people, if the assumption is the texts are being written to further a certain agenda that says Jesus is infallible, and then there are writings that show in some ways, and again, this is just a hypothetical, that Jesus had flaws, if those writings are in those same texts, historians will give those more credit. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's accurate. We just have to be careful with the situations where we are saying that applies or doesn't apply. So let's keep moving. You
also look for things that are that make sense in his own historical and cultural context. And so if you've got sayings of Jesus that really don't fit into early first century Israel, then he probably didn't say it. I mean, and sometimes you actually look for anachronisms. For example, if you were
okay, so I got to pause this here. This is just not true. This statement that if we have statements that don't make sense in the early first century Israel, Jesus probably didn't say them, it's just not true. And it's objectively not true because we have documents from that period that say that Jesus said these things. So at a minimum, this was what people were writing down. Even if we just say, for hypothetically, for sake of argument, that it was fraudulently, there was a worldview that felt that this even fraudulently written statement was worthy of putting down and copying. So that just automatically discredits the argument that in the first century, this could not have been a view of first century Judaism or Judeo-Christianity. It's just inaccurate. And again, there's good reason to believe that these statements were not fraudulent. But even setting that aside, these are the kinds of grandiose, hand-waved statements, unbacked by any kind of evidence or historical context, that if you don't pay attention and aren't careful, you'll just allow these to be considered to be accurate. So let's keep moving.
Today, if you open a cookbook that says it was written in 1890, and the recipe tells you to stick something in your microwave, okay, yeah, this was not written in 1890.
Yeah. So again, this is true, right? If we had a gospel text that said Jesus called Matthew on his cell phone, we would all know that could not have been written in the first century. But again, that is not what we have here. And so it's really important to see the sleight of hand here. The argument is there are statements that are made about Jesus that didn't align with other first century Jewish beliefs. For now, let's just accept that as true. That does not then mean that those statements could not have been written in the first century. That is not an appropriate inference, because we know, and we have extremely good reason to believe, again, for another conversation for another time, that these documents were written in the first century. So there's no question really right now about the fact that these documents were written in the first century. That's not debated. But this sleight of hand almost makes it seem as if, well, there are things that are appearing in these texts that could not have appeared in a first century context. That's just not true. It's just not a true statement. It's not a true inference. And we have to be careful when we hear stuff like this to make sure that we're not allowing ourselves to just automatically buy it without question.
And so you look for, that's called an anachronism, where it's in the wrong time period. So that's the kind of thing you look for. Multiple sayings, independently attested. You look, especially just the ones that you're pretty sure he would have said would be ones that don't go along with what Christians would want to say. You've got to fit in the first century context. Things like that.
Great. So agreed. No real debate here. Multiple sayings, independently attested, would be the kind of things that you would expect to see at the time, and don't contain things that are pretty clearly, obviously added in later, such as a microwave. Fair. Let's go on.
And would an example of that be something like, would an example of something that a Christian would not have invented is from being a saying of Jesus, like sell your clothes and buy swords? Would that be a good example of that?
Well, that's a good question. It kind of depends how militarily oriented the particular Christian is. You may have some Christian who really believes in the revolution. And so, it's possible that that's put on his lips. But, given the fact that there's so many sayings of his that are more directed in precisely the opposite direction, you have to debate. And then,
so again, here I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. This is it's just sort of next in the video. But again, look here. There's a statement here that appears, at least in context, to be the argument here a little more kind of militarily leaning than what one thinks Jesus might have said. There are two issues here that we got to pay attention to. So one is this being put on Jesus's lips by someone else at a later time? And the second is this statement a statement that would have been said by someone at the time in the first century? It's a statement that we can attribute to someone from the first century. The second part is absolutely true. We can attribute it to someone for the first century because that's when these documents were written. The first thing about whether or not this is something that Jesus would have said or not is not anything. There's no evidence that's being given that Jesus wouldn't have said it, and there are lots of apologists and historians who perfectly reconcile a statement like this. And so this statement by itself really proves nothing one way or another.
This is why scholars have these controversies, because some people think, well, that's more likely. Others think, well, that's more likely. And so you come up with the Jesus Seminar making a list of sayings, most of which Jesus never said. And other scholars say, yeah, actually, I think he did say that one. But the two sorts thing, I would say that's probably, I mean, it seems, I don't know, it seems unlike what Jesus says elsewhere. Maybe followers of Jesus were more revolutionarily minded, especially in the early decades. I don't know. But so that would be a candidate for something that somebody probably put on his lips, I guess.
And what were the last words of Jesus? Like, what is most likely what Jesus, what was most likely his last words? And the reason I put it that way is because, like, I mean, as you know, the four Gospels don't agree with each other about what Jesus supposedly said, or what his last words supposedly were.
Yeah.
So are we supposed to just default to what Mark says, or is there additional criteria that's utilized to try to sort out which one of them is authentic?
So before we get to the answer here, and I'll probably wrap up this video at least at this point, and spend a little more time on this analysis in some later videos. I don't want this thing to run on too long. I think we're already around 20 something minutes, but let's just wrap up here on this issue of Mark, because as you may or may not know, on my channel, I started this channel really focusing on Mark and priority, and really the exceptionally flawed historical and academic analysis that led to the just perplexing unanimity in biblical scholarship that the Gospel of Mark was the first of the canonical Gospels to be written. I've done lots of videos on it. I'll just take a couple seconds here to point out, you should please go watch those, because they really do a much better job analyzing than I'll be able to kind of quickly put together here. But there is no evidence that Mark was first. There's no extrinsic evidence that Mark was first. In fact, all the extrinsic evidence is stuff from later writers, second century and beyond, historians, all have Matthew being first. If they talk about priority, they have Matthew first. The analysis of the synoptic gospel analysis that shows portions of Mark appearing in Matthew and Luke and vice versa and all around. Again, I've done a whole dive on this. It's just perplexing to someone from my background how anyone could conclude that points to priority in any direction, right? These analyses at best wash out, and I think if we really had to sort of drill down, we'd stick with first principles, which says, hey, the extrinsic evidence says it's Matthew, and there's nothing in the intrinsic evidence that says otherwise. Matthew's first. The reason why this is important, for a bunch of other reasons, and again, this is what we'll wrap up on today, is because the placing of Mark being first does a few things that are sleight of hand, and if you don't understand what's going on, you'll miss it. The first issue is, by placing Mark first, what it says is Mark, which we know by testimony, by historical documents, was not an eyewitness. Mark was not an eyewitness, and if Mark is first, and Mark is 40-something years later, which we'll get to, then anything that came after Mark presumably wasn't written by an eyewitness either. So automatically, just by saying Mark is first, you're eliminating the possibility that the Gospels could have been written by eyewitnesses, despite the fact that there's historical testimony and evidence that at least Matthew was an eyewitness account, and perhaps also John. Okay, so that's the first thing. Mark being first really puts skepticism on the issue of whether Matthew could have, if Matthew was later, could have really truly been an eyewitness account. Then there are analyses in Mark, temple destruction. We'll call these prophecies. They're really, I think prophecy is probably too strong of a word, but temple destruction kind of statements that are really allegorical and could really be argued to be not particularly prophetic at all, but even just assume that they are, where scholars have come to say, since those appear in Mark, and Mark is first, and the destruction of the temple occurred in AD 70, Mark could not have been written before AD 70, which means that anything that came after Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, had to have been written after AD 70. This would have been some 40 odd years after Jesus' crucifixion, and likely these writers would be gone. Again, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of whether or not Matthew or the witnesses could have survived 40 years or whatnot. We'll just accept that argument as it's framed. All of that comes from the argument that Mark is first. If Mark is not first, and Matthew is instead first, as all the historical evidence suggests, and the intrinsic evidence shows nothing to the contrary, if it's Matthew that's first, well then that entire analysis collapses, because Matthew very well could have been an eyewitness. That's what the earliest historians claim, and that would push the Gospel of Matthew much earlier. If Matthew wrote it or was responsible for it or gave the testimony for it, etc., that would push the text naturally much earlier than 70. And then analyses that flow from Mark being first, such as this so-called development of Christology and everything else, all really wash away because a lot of the stuff is in Matthew. And if Matthew has many of the statements about Jesus and Jesus as the Messiah and Jesus as the Son of God, if that's in Matthew and Matthew's earlier, then we almost don't care what Mark says, at least in this context, because we point to the earliest gospel as being most likely to be the most reliable source, as their scholars are currently doing with Mark. And so it's really, really important to probe and ask, why are scholars arguing unanimously that Mark is first when there's no archaeological evidence, no historical evidence, and extremely poor, in fact terrible, extrinsic evidence supporting Mark and priority. I'm going to wrap it up here and probably continue on this. I'll link this video in the description from History Valley. Again, not trying to criticize the people themselves in these videos. I really try not to do that, but I think these arguments that are put forth are truly, truly bad. Thanks for listening.